You wake up in ancient Egypt around 2500 BCE. The good news is, you're not a farmer breaking your back in the fields or a construction worker hauling limestone blocks under the scorching Sunday. You're educated, literate, and technically part of the elite. You can read and write hieroglyphs, which makes you rarer than a unicorn in a world where maybe 1% of the population knows how to spell their own name. But here's the catch. Your entire survival depends on perfect handwriting and never making a mistake on papyrus that costs more than most people earn in a year. One smudged hieroglyph on a tax record could end your career faster than you can say unemployment benefits don't exist yet. One miscalculated grain inventory could send you straight back to manual labor, and trust me, you didn't survive the brutal desert just to end up hauling rocks again. You didn't even survive the brutal desert, actually. You survived something worse. Ancient Egyptian kindergarten, where teachers routinely beat students with sticks because the word for teach literally comes from the same root as beat. Congratulations. You've just landed history's first high-pressure office job, complete with impossible deadlines, soul-crushing bureaucracy, and paperwork that never ends. But before you get comfortable, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day begins with the most frustrating ritual in human history: preparing your writing equipment. Your reed pen, made from the stem of Juncus maritimus, needs constant maintenance. You have to hammer the tip soft to make the fibers separate, then carefully trim it to create something that resembles a brush. Even when it's perfect, it still writes like a dying paintbrush dipped in mud. Modern office workers complain about cheap ballpoint pens, but at least their pens don't require daily reconstructive surgery. Next comes the ink mixing nightmare. Black ink requires combining soot with vegetable gum, stirring until you achieve the perfect consistency that won't blob on your papyrus or fade into legibility. Red ink demands the same process, but with added red ochre dust. Red ink isn't just for decoration. It's the blood of your mistakes, used for corrections, titles, and marking the beginning of new sections. Your tutors used red ink to mark your errors during training, a practice that somehow survived thousands of years to haunt modern students. The papyrus situation is where things get truly stressful. This isn't paper from the corner store. This is handmade writing material that costs more than most people make in months. Each sheet requires slicing papyrus reeds into strips, laying them in horizontal and vertical layers, applying vegetable gum, pounding flat with mallets, and drying under heavy weights. The process is so expensive that you practice on ostraka, broken pottery shards, because actual papyrus is literally worth more than slaves in some markets. Your scribal palette becomes your most precious possession. It's a flat piece of wood or stone with two carefully carved depressions, one for black ink, one for red. It also holds your reed pens and a small water container. This palette represents your entire career, and you guard it like your life depends on it. Because it does. One spill, one crack, one moment of clumsiness could ruin everything you've worked for. But the real torture begins with your posture. You spend your entire workday sitting cross-legged on the floor or kneeling, hunched over your work like a question mark made of human misery. Your spine curves into an unnatural arch as you lean forward to see your writing clearly. Your neck cranes down at angles that would make modern chiropractors weep. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient scribes developed severe osteoarthritis in their knees, shoulders, necks, and spines from this position. They literally work themselves into skeletal deformation. The walk to work becomes a daily exercise in terror management. You're carrying fragile, expensive equipment through dusty streets filled with donkeys, construction workers, and general chaos. One bump from a passing cart, one stumble on uneven stones, one moment of inattention could send your palette crashing to the ground, shattering your inkwells and destroying your livelihood. You navigate the morning crowds like you're carrying nitroglycerin, because in economic terms, you basically are. By the time you reach your workplace, you're already exhausted from the stress of just getting there with your equipment intact, and your actual workday hasn't even begun. Your job is essentially being a human calculator and filing cabinet for an entire civilization's paperwork. You're the living, breathing database of ancient Egypt, responsible for recording every grain of wheat, every copper ingot, and every tax payment that keeps this empire running. Modern office workers think they have it bad with spreadsheets and databases, but at least their mistakes don't get carved in stone for eternity. The morning starts with grain inventory documentation. You're stationed at a granary where workers dump thousands of wheat sheaves while you frantically count and record. The problem is, counting isn't as simple as 1, 2, 3 when you're dealing with hieroglyphic numerals and arguing scribes. You write down 2,847 bundles delivered from the southern district, but the scribe next to you insists it was 3,848. Now you're both recounting while the foreman screams about delays and the grain sits exposed to birds and moisture. One wrong number means the difference between a village eating or starving, and guess whose head rolls if the count is wrong? Not the foreman's. Between grain counts, you're drafting official correspondence for illiterate officials who dictate pompous letters they can't actually read themselves. Picture this: a district governor who can't spell his own name dictating a formal complaint to the vizier about border disputes. He uses big words he doesn't understand, changes his mind mid-sentence, and demands you make him sound more impressive. You're essentially ghostwriting for someone who thinks literacy is beneath him but needs your skills to maintain his authority. The irony is suffocating. Tax collection documentation brings its own special hell. Every number must be perfect because the vizier personally reviews tax records, and he's been known to have scribes caned for arithmetic errors. You're calculating percentages of grain harvests, livestock counts, and craft production quotas while taxpayers argue about their assessments. The farmer claims his harvest was damaged by floods, the potter insists half his vessels cracked in firing, and the fisherman swears the Nile gods cursed his nets. You have to determine who's lying, who's genuinely struggling, and who can afford to pay more, all while maintaining the mathematical precision that keeps Egypt's economy functioning. Court proceedings turn you into a frantic stenographer trying to capture legal arguments in real-time hieroglyphs. Imagine taking shorthand in a writing system with over 700 symbols, while two lawyers argue about property boundaries using ancient precedents you've never heard of. The judge speaks quickly, witnesses contradict each other, and you're expected to create a permanent legal record that might be referenced for decades. Miss a crucial detail, and an innocent person could lose their land or freedom. Get a name wrong, and you've just created a legal nightmare that could destroy lives. Military records demand the emotional detachment of a spreadsheet combined with the precision of a surgeon. You document troop movements, weapon inventories, and casualty reports with clinical efficiency. Today's assignment: recording the deployment of 500 soldiers to the Nubian border. You list their names, ranks, equipment allotments, and next of kin information. Tomorrow, some of these names will appear on casualty lists you'll also have to write. You're simultaneously the military's memory and its conscience, preserving both its victories and its losses in permanent ink. Your lunch break offers no real respite. You eat stale bread and drink warm beer while watching construction workers consume even worse food, reminding yourself that literacy saved you from their fate. But the break is brief, because afternoon brings the most terrifying task: copying religious texts. One wrong symbol in a prayer to the gods could be considered blasphemy. One misplaced hieroglyph in a funeral inscription could damn someone's soul for eternity. The priests hover over your shoulder, checking every stroke, while you fight a tremor in your hand caused by pure terror. The hierarchy is brutal in ways modern office politics can't match. You serve viziers who treat you like a talking abacus, valuable but replaceable. They bark orders, change requirements mid-task, and blame you for their own poor planning. Yet you still outrank everyone who can't read, which creates its own psychological burden. You look down on illiterate officials while simultaneously serving them, creating a cognitive dissonance that eats at your soul. The constant pressure of permanent ink means every stroke could be your career's death sentence. There's no delete key, no correction fluid, no crumpling up mistakes and starting over. When you make an error, everyone sees it. Red ink corrections mark your failures for posterity. Too many mistakes, and you're replaced by one of the hundreds of scribes competing for your position. As the day winds down, you're processing the final batch of documents. Birth registrations, death certificates, marriage contracts, and property transfers. Each document represents a human life-changing course, and you're the one ensuring these changes are recorded accurately for future generations. Your hand cramps around the reed pen, your back screams from hours of hunching, and your eyes strain from squinting at tiny hieroglyphs in fading daylight. The sun sets over the Nile as you complete your final tallies, knowing that tomorrow will bring another avalanche of counting, writing, and careful navigation through Egypt's bureaucratic maze. You've survived another day as the empire's human computer, processing the endless data that keeps civilization running, one perfectly formed hieroglyph at a time. You're technically elite, but let's be honest about what that actually means. You're essentially a glorified secretary to the most demanding boss in human history, the pharaoh and his endless bureaucratic machine. Sure, you can read and write, which makes you special in a world where literacy is rarer than honest politicians, but your education has trapped you in a different kind of servitude. You traded the physical chains of manual labor for the mental chains of endless paperwork and impossible expectations. Scribal training was supposedly your ticket out of peasant life. Your parents probably sacrificed everything to send you to temple school, dreaming you'd escape the back-breaking work of farming or construction. And technically, you did escape. You don't pay taxes, you're exempt from military service, and you'll never have to haul limestone blocks in the desert heat. But now you're trapped in a bureaucratic prison where your mind does all the heavy lifting, and the weight of an empire's administration rests on your cramped shoulders. The irony is suffocating. You spend your days looking down on farmers, while your job is literally counting their grain and documenting their misery. You calculate their tax burdens, record their crop yields, and tally their livestock, all while knowing that one bad harvest could destroy their lives. You're simultaneously their superior and their accountant, elevated above them by literacy but chained to their fate by the very system that privileges you. You're the middleman in their exploitation, the educated face of their oppression. Your education makes you valuable, but here's the terrifying truth. You're also completely expendable. There are always more scribes graduating from temple schools, eager young men who've spent decades learning to write hieroglyphs and calculate grain percentages. They're hungry for your position, willing to work longer hours for less food, ready to replace you the moment you make too many mistakes or displease the wrong official. Job security doesn't exist when your entire profession depends on never making errors. Marriage prospects do improve thanks to your literacy. Women find educated men attractive, especially when most men can't write their own names. But your professional hazards aren't exactly romantic. Your hands are permanently cramped into claw-like shapes from gripping reed pens. Your spine curves like a question mark from years of hunching over papyrus. Your eyes strain from squinting at tiny hieroglyphs in poor light. You're an educated man with the physical appearance of someone who's been slowly tortured by his career. Access to the inner circles of power sounds glamorous until you realize what it actually means. You witness political intrigue, corruption, and decision-making that affects thousands of lives, but you can never discuss any of it. You're the ultimate insider, with no voice, privy to state secrets that could get you killed if you breathe a word. You know which officials are embezzling grain, which generals are planning coups, and which priests are skimming temple donations. But your job is to record these facts, not act on them. The constant fear haunts every scribe. Administrative reforms could eliminate your position overnight. The pharaoh decides to reorganize the bureaucracy, consolidate departments, or implement new record-keeping systems, and suddenly your specialized skills are obsolete. You've spent decades mastering hieroglyphic accounting methods, and now they want everything done in hieratic script with different procedures. Adapt or starve. Because there's no unemployment insurance in ancient Egypt, your children will likely inherit your job, which sounds like a blessing but feels like a curse. You're trapping another generation in the same bureaucratic nightmare that's slowly destroying your body and soul. Your son will spend his childhood learning to write hieroglyphs instead of playing, enduring the same brutal education system that shaped you, preparing for the same life of endless counting and careful handwriting. You've escaped peasant life only to create a dynasty of educated servants. The psychological burden of your position eats away at you daily. You're educated enough to understand the system's injustices but powerless to change them. You see how the empire exploits its people, how the wealthy avoid taxes while the poor are crushed by them, how corruption flows through every level of government like the Nile through the Delta. Your literacy makes you complicit in perpetuating these injustices, but your dependence on the system prevents you from opposing them. You exist in a strange social limbo, too educated for manual labor, but too subordinate for real power. Officials treat you like a useful tool, valuable when they need documents written, but dismissible when the work is done. You outrank illiterate workers, but serve literate nobles, creating a hierarchy where you're simultaneously superior and inferior, privileged and exploited, essential and replaceable. You return home to a modest but solid house, better than the mud brick hovels where most Egyptians live, but nothing compared to the limestone mansions of the officials you serve. Your home reflects your status perfectly, comfortable enough to remind you that literacy saved you from poverty, humble enough to remind you that you're still a servant to more powerful men. Your writing hand aches with the deep, bone-level pain that comes from gripping reed pens for 10 hours straight. The muscles in your fingers have locked into the same curved position they held all day, and straightening them sends shooting pains up your arm. Your back throbs from hunching over papyrus, each vertebra protesting the unnatural curve you've forced your spine to maintain. Archaeological evidence suggests that scribes like you developed severe osteoarthritis by middle age, their skeletons permanently deformed by their profession. The oil lamp flickers as you review tomorrow's assignments, casting dancing shadows across the papyrus scrolls that contain your next day's torture. A tax assessment for the Northern District, grain inventory for 3 granaries, and court proceedings for a property dispute that's been dragging on for months. Each task carries the weight of potential career destruction, one mistake away from sending you back to the fields you worked so hard to escape. You reflect on the people whose lives you documented today, the farmer whose grain you counted, knowing he'll barely have enough left to feed his family after taxes, the soldier whose deployment you recorded, wondering if you'll be writing his death notice next month, the taxpayer whose burden you calculated, watching his face crumple as he realized he'd have to sell his donkey to pay what the state demanded. Unlike them, you're safe from physical labor, but your mind bears the exhaustion of processing an empire's endless details, of being the human computer that keeps civilization running. The sounds of the evening Nile drift through your window, fishermen calling to each other as they check their nets, children playing in the shallows, merchants haggling over tomorrow's grain prices. Life continues around you while you massage cramped fingers and prepare for sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring more counting, more writing, more careful navigation through Egypt's bureaucratic maze. Your last thought before sleep is that you survived another day in history's first office job, where the pen truly was mightier than the sword and infinitely more stressful. Rome in 1305 was a war zone. The Colonna and Orsini families turned the streets into battlefields, their private armies clashing outside the very churches where popes were supposed to pray. Buildings crumbled from decades of neglect, sewage ran through the streets, and bandits controlled entire neighborhoods. The Pope couldn't walk from his palace to St. Peter's Basilica without armed guards, and the very real possibility of an arrow finding its mark. This wasn't how the leader of Christianity was supposed to live, but Pope Boniface VIII had picked a fight with the wrong king, and now his successors were paying the price. The unthinkable was about to happen. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the Pope would abandon Rome entirely. What started as a temporary move to the sleepy French town of Avignon would become a 70-year scandal that split Christianity down the middle and changed the church forever. The trouble started with Pope Boniface VIII, a man who believed papal authority trumped everything, including kings. When King Philip IV of France decided to tax church property to fund his wars against England, Boniface lost his mind. This wasn't just about money. For centuries, church lands had been untouchable, sacred property that no earthly ruler could touch. Philip was essentially declaring that kings outranked popes. Boniface fired back with a nuclear option of medieval politics, his Unam Sanctam, in 1302. In it, he declared that every human creature must be subject to the Roman Pope for salvation, not just spiritually, but politically. Philip's response was swift and brutal. On September 7, 1303, French soldiers and Italian mercenaries stormed into the Pope's own palace in Anagni. They found the 68-year-old Boniface sitting on his throne, wearing his papal robes and tiara, waiting for them. The leader of the group, Guillaume de Nogaret, walked up to the Pope and slapped him across the face. They held him prisoner for 3 days, planning to drag him back to France for a show trial. The townspeople eventually freed Boniface, but the damage was done. The Pope died just weeks later, reportedly from the shock and humiliation. The message was crystal clear. Popes weren't untouchable anymore. Kings could reach them, hurt them, even kill them. Philip wasn't finished. He demanded that the next Pope, Benedict XI, put Boniface on trial posthumously for heresy. When Benedict refused and died mysteriously after just 8 months, Philip made sure the cardinals elected his man, a French archbishop named Bertrand de Got, who became Pope Clement V. Rome had become a death trap. The Colonna family who'd helped the French attack Boniface still controlled parts of the city. Their enemies, the Orsini, wanted revenge. Street battles were constant, and any pope who stayed would be caught in the crossfire. The French king offered protection, but only if the pope came to France. Clement V looked at the smoking ruins of papal authority in Rome and made the most controversial decision in church history: he'd pack up and leave the Eternal City behind. Pope Clement V told everyone this would be temporary, just a quick trip to France to sort things out, maybe a year or two until Rome calmed down. That was in 1309. The popes wouldn't see Rome again for nearly 70 years. Clement chose Avignon for practical reasons. The city technically belonged to papal vassals, so he wasn't completely under French control. It sat on the Rhone River, making travel and communication easier. Most importantly, it was far enough from Rome's chaos but close enough to French protection. What started as a modest arrangement in a Dominican monastery would become the most expensive real estate project in medieval Europe. The first few popes made do with borrowed spaces, but Benedict XII had bigger plans. In 1334, he decided the papacy needed a proper home and began construction of what would become the largest Gothic palace in Europe. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress, an office building, and a symbol of power all rolled into one massive stone monument. The numbers are staggering. The Pallidus Papis covered 15,000 square meters of floor space, roughly the size of 4 football fields, stacked on top of each other. Its walls rose 50 meters high, thick enough to withstand siege engines. 12 towers crowned the structure, each one a mini-fortress in its own right. The construction consumed so much of the papal treasury that historians estimate it ate up nearly half the church's annual income for decades. Inside, the palace was pure medieval luxury. The wine cellars could hold thousands of barrels. Apparently, spiritual leadership required serious storage capacity. The Great Tynel, the main reception hall, stretched 52 meters long and could seat 300 guests for banquets. Tapestries covered every wall, their starry blue backgrounds creating an artificial night sky indoors. The papal apartments featured private bathrooms, a luxury most kings couldn't afford, and heated floors using an ingenious system of underground furnaces. The most absurd room was Clement VI's private study, decorated with hunting scenes of nobles chasing deer through painted forests. This was supposedly where the Pope contemplated spiritual matters, surrounded by images of aristocrats enjoying their favorite pastime. The message was unmistakable. The papacy had become indistinguishable from French nobility. The palace's chapel rivaled the greatest cathedrals. 48 meters long, with soaring Gothic arches. It housed the papal library, over 2,000 volumes, the largest collection in Europe. Scholars flocked to Avignon, including Petrarch, who would later call the place the Babylon of the West. The irony was perfect. The man who helped establish humanism was drawn to study in a palace that represented everything wrong with institutional Christianity. The papal court transformed completely. Instead of humble servants of God, the popes lived like kings. They employed over 1,000 people, from cooks and stable boys to secretaries and accountants. The bureaucracy exploded from 200 officials to over 500, all housed within the palace walls. Cardinals built their own mansions around Avignon, creating a papal suburb of luxury that would have made Roman emperors jealous. Benedict XII's successor, Clement VI, doubled down on the extravagance. He expanded the palace, adding a second section that made the already massive structure even more ridiculous. His banquets became legendary: silver and gold plates, exotic foods, entertainment that lasted for days. When criticized for the excess, Clement reportedly said his predecessors didn't know how to be pope. The spiritual leader of Christianity had become a heavily fortified French landlord. The pope, who was supposed to follow Christ's example of moderation, now lived in the most expensive building in Europe, protected by walls thick enough to stop armies and surrounded by enough luxury to shame kings. This wasn't temporary anymore. The papacy had found something in Avignon it never had in Rome: financial security, political protection, and the freedom to live like the aristocrats they'd become. Why would they ever want to leave? The Avignon popes discovered something that would revolutionize institutional fundraising forever. When you control people's eternal salvation, you can charge whatever you want. What started as traditional church income quickly evolved into the most sophisticated money-making operation medieval Europe had ever seen. The basic economics were irresistible. In Rome, the popes constantly fought local families for control of church revenues. Half their income disappeared into bribes, security costs, and reconstruction after the latest street battle. But in Avignon, protected by French power and freed from Roman chaos, every gold coin that came in stayed in papal hands. The difference was transformative. Pope John XXII, who reigned from 1316 to 1334, turned papal finances into a science. This former banker from Cahors understood money in ways his predecessors never had. He looked at the church's traditional revenue streams: donations, tithes, fees for services, and saw massive untapped potential. Why settle for voluntary contributions? when you could create mandatory taxes. The first innovation was annates, essentially a first-year salary tax on newly appointed bishops and abbots. Every time someone got promoted in the church hierarchy, the Pope claimed their entire first year of income. Since the Pope controlled most high-level appointments, this created a guaranteed revenue stream. Bishops had to pay up or lose their positions. It was brilliant and ruthless. But John XXII wasn't finished. He invented something called expectancies, basically selling future job rights like medieval stock options. Want to become a bishop when the current one dies? Pay the Pope now for the right to be considered. Want to guarantee your son gets the next available monastery position? That'll cost extra. The Pope was literally selling jobs that didn't exist yet to multiple buyers, collecting money from everyone who hoped to get promoted. The system created perverse incentives throughout the church. Bishops who'd paid massive fees for their positions needed to recover their investments. So they squeezed their local parishes harder. Parish priests, facing increased demands from above, became more aggressive about collecting tithes and fees. The financial pressure trickled down through every level of church hierarchy. The papal bureaucracy exploded to manage all this money. In 1200, the papal administration employed maybe 200 people. By 1316, that number hit 500 and kept growing. The apostolic camera, the church's treasury department, became more important than the College of Cardinals. Accountants wielded more influence than theologians. Every possible church service became a revenue opportunity. Want a marriage annulled? Pay the Pope. Need dispensation to marry your cousin? That's extra. Converting from Judaism and want to visit your unconverted parents? The Pope sells special permits. Even basic literacy requirements for priests could be waived for the right price. If you had enough gold, the church would bend any rule. The most cynical innovation was the sale of indulgences on an industrial scale. These weren't just forgiveness for sins. They were get-out-of-purgatory free cards sold to anyone with money. The popes marketed them aggressively, sending professional salesmen across Europe with price lists. Minor sins cost less, major ones more. Family packages were available. The church had turned salvation into a commodity. Pope Clement VI, the most extravagant of the Avignon popes, perfected the art of papal fundraising. He declared 1350 a holy year and offered special indulgences to anyone who made pilgrimage donations. When the Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, he sold indulgences for the dead, promising to reduce their time in purgatory. Even global catastrophe became a business opportunity. The financial results were staggering. Papal income increased by over 300% during the Avignon period. The church became the wealthiest institution in Europe, richer than most kingdoms. The Pope's annual revenue exceeded that of the King of France, and unlike kings, he didn't have to maintain armies or fight wars. This wasn't just about greed, though there was plenty of that. The Avignon system created a template for modern institutional fundraising. Mandatory fees, subscription models, premium services, future contracts. The medieval church invented techniques that corporations still use today. They proved that if you control something people desperately need, you can charge whatever the market will bear. The irony was perfect. The popes had fled Rome to escape political corruption, only to create financial corruption on a scale the Romans never imagined. They'd accidentally invented aggressive institutional fundraising while trying to fund their luxury lifestyle in a French castle. By 1377, even the French were getting tired of their papal houseguests. The Avignon popes had become an embarrassment, too rich, too corrupt, and too obviously under French control. When Pope Gregory XI announced he was moving back to Rome, most people assumed this would end the 70-year experiment in papal relocation. Gregory packed up the papal court and made a journey south, arriving in Rome in January 1377. But the Eternal City hadn't improved much in 7 decades. The same feuding families still controlled different neighborhoods. Buildings were still crumbling. the papal apartments were still death traps. Gregory took one look around and immediately regretted his decision. He died just over a year later, possibly from the stress of trying to govern from a city that didn't want him there. The cardinals who gathered to elect Gregory's successor faced an impossible choice. The Roman crowds surrounded their meeting place, shouting demands for an Italian pope. These weren't polite requests. This was a mob threatening violence if the cardinals dared elect another Frenchman. Under pressure, they chose Urban VI, an Italian who promised to reform the church and end the corruption of the Avignon years. Urban turned out to be a disaster. Instead of diplomatic reform, he launched brutal attacks on the cardinals who'd elected him. He accused them of corruption, threatened to strip their wealth, and generally treated the College of Cardinals like criminals. These were the same men who'd grown accustomed to luxury and political influence during the Avignon years. They weren't about to accept lectures from an Italian reformer. The French cardinals decided they'd made a mistake. In September 1378, they declared Urban's election invalid, claiming they'd been coerced by the Roman mob, and elected their own pope, Clement VII. He immediately moved back to Avignon, setting up shop in the same palace his predecessors had built. Christianity now had two popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to Street, Peter. Urban VI controlled Rome and had the support of most Italian states, England, and parts of Germany. Clement VII ruled from Avignon with backing from France, Scotland, and Spain. Both issued papal bulls, appointed bishops, and collected taxes. Both claimed divine authority and declared the other a heretical pretender. The bureaucratic nightmare was immediate. Every diocese had to choose sides. Bishops found themselves excommunicated by one pope while being praised by the other. University professors debated which papal decrees were valid. Ordinary Christians had no idea whose authority to follow for marriages, baptisms, or confessions. The situation got worse in 1409 when a group of cardinals from both sides decided to solve the problem by electing a third pope, Alexander V, at the Council of Pisa. Instead of ending the schism, this created an even more absurd situation. Three men simultaneously claiming to be Christ's representative on earth. Each had their own bureaucracy, their own supporters, and their own claims to legitimacy. The Western Schism, as historians call it, lasted until 1417. The Council of Constance finally resolved the crisis by deposing all three competing popes and electing Martin V as the single legitimate successor. But the damage to church credibility was permanent. For nearly 40 years, Christianity had multiple CEOs, each claiming divine authority while obviously pursuing political and financial interests. The Pope's claim to spiritual supremacy looked ridiculous when there were three of them fighting over who got to wear the funny hat. The institution that claimed to represent God's will on earth had proven it couldn't even manage its own succession without descending into bureaucratic chaos. The Great Schism revealed what the Avignon Papacy had really accomplished. The church had become just another medieval corporation, complete with competing management teams, territorial disputes, and hostile takeovers. The spiritual authority that had intimidated kings for centuries was gone, replaced by the kind of institutional infighting that made medieval politics look dignified by comparison. 70 years of spiritual gridlock over real estate preferences. That's the legacy of the Avignon Papacy. The most powerful religious institution in medieval Europe abandoned its sacred center because the Pope couldn't handle Roman street politics, then spent 7 decades proving that luxury and political protection mattered more than spiritual authority. The ultimate lesson in how power politics corrupts religious authority, turning shepherds of souls into heavily fortified French landlords who invented aggressive fundraising while living in the most expensive castle in Europe. You're standing on Commercial Street in Boston's North End on January 15, 1919, when you hear it. A roar louder than a passing train, deeper than thunder, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. You turn toward the sound just as 2.3 million gallons of molasses explode from their steel prison. This isn't a gentle leak or a slow ooze. This is 13,000 tons of syrup moving like a freight train, creating a dark, sticky wave that towers 25 feet above the street. It's rushing toward you at 35 miles per hour, fast enough to snap steel beams, strong enough to lift buildings off their foundations and hurl them like toys. 21 people won't survive the next few minutes. They'll drown, suffocate, and get crushed in what becomes America's most bizarre industrial accident. This is the story of how one city literally drowned in dessert, and how corporate greed turned breakfast syrup into a weapon of mass destruction. Meet the real villain of our story. A massive steel tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company. At 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, this thing could hold enough molasses to fill a small lake. But calling it built is generous. Slapped together might be more accurate. The man responsible for this disaster was Arthur Yell, the company treasurer who somehow got put in charge of construction. Yell had exactly 0 engineering experience, which becomes painfully obvious when you look at what he built. The tank started leaking molasses from the very first day it was filled in 1915. Locals called it the weeping tank because syrup constantly seeped through the walls. Kids would bring cups to collect free molasses like it was some kind of sticky water fountain. Did the company fix the leaks? Of course not. Their brilliant solution was to paint the entire tank brown so you couldn't see the molasses running down the sides. Problem solved, right? They also decided to ignore the groaning sounds the tank made every time it was filled, as if a giant steel container screaming in pain was totally normal. The construction itself was criminally negligent. The steel walls were half as thick as they should have been for a tank that size. Even worse, the steel lacked manganese, which made it brittle in cold weather. Boston winters regularly drop below freezing, but apparently nobody thought this might be relevant when building a massive container filled with liquid. The rivets holding the whole thing together were flawed from the start. The walls buckled under pressure, cracks formed at the rivet holes and spread like spider webs through the metal. This wasn't just poor construction, it was a 13,000-ton bomb waiting to explode. Why the rush job? Money, naturally. World War I had created massive demand for industrial alcohol, which was made from fermented molasses and used in munitions. The company was racing to beat prohibition, which everyone knew was coming. They needed to squeeze every possible drop of profit from their alcohol production before the government shut them down. So they cut corners everywhere. No proper safety testing. No qualified engineers. No consideration for the people living in the shadow of their death trap. The tank was filled to capacity only 8 times in its short life, which meant the walls were constantly expanding and contracting under cyclical loads they weren't designed to handle. Company executives knew the tank was dangerous. Employees brought them chunks of metal that had broken off as evidence of the structural problems. The executives' response: the tank still stands. That was their entire safety philosophy, is less if it hasn't killed anyone yet. It must be fine. Local residents complained about the leaks, the noise, and the obvious signs that something was wrong. But this was the North End, home to poor Italian immigrants who had little political power. The company picked this location precisely because they knew nobody would fight back effectively. These weren't wealthy Bostonians with lawyers and political connections. These were working-class families just trying to survive, and their safety meant nothing to the men in suits counting profits. The tank sat there for 4 years, weeping molasses, groaning under pressure, and slowly falling apart. Every day it stood was borrowed time. Every time it was filled was another roll of the dice. The only question wasn't whether it would fail, but when, and how many people would die when it finally gave up. January 15th. 1919 starts like any other winter day in Boston, except for one crucial difference. The weather decides to play a deadly trick. The temperature jumps from a bitter 2 degrees Fahrenheit to a surprisingly mild 41 degrees Fahrenheit in just 24 hours. Most Bostonians probably welcome the break from the cold, but inside that steel tank on Commercial Street, physics is preparing for murder. The day before, a fresh shipment of warm molasses had been pumped into the tank. This wasn't unusual. Ships regularly delivered their sticky cargo to keep the distillery running. But this time, the warm molasses sits on top of older, colder syrup that's been there for weeks. The temperature difference creates layers of different densities, like oil floating on water, except both layers are trying to expand at different rates. As the morning sun heats the tank, the molasses inside begins to behave like a science experiment gone wrong. The warm syrup expands, pressing against the cold layer below. The cold molasses, now warmed from above, starts expanding too. Pressure builds inside the tank like air in a balloon, but this balloon is already cracked and held together with faulty rivets. At exactly 12:30 p.m., the tank finally surrenders. Witnesses describe the sound as something between thunder and a machine gun. The rivets shoot out like bullets, pinging off buildings and embedding in walls across the street. The steel walls don't just crack, they explode outward with the force of a bomb. One massive section of the tank wall flies 200 feet and slams into the supports of the elevated railway, nearly derailing a train. But it's what happens next that turns this industrial accident into a nightmare. The molasses doesn't pour out, it erupts. 2.5 million gallons of syrup hit the street like a tsunami, creating a wave that's initially 25 feet high and 160 feet wide. This isn't the slow, thick molasses you know from your kitchen. This is a non-Newtonian fluid under extreme pressure, which means it flows like water when it's moving fast, but thickens into concrete when it slows down. The wave hits Commercial Street at 35 miles per hour. That's faster than most people can run, especially when they're caught completely off guard. The molasses doesn't flow around obstacles, it destroys them. Buildings get swept off their foundations, like dollhouses. A firehouse collapses, trapping firefighters inside. Trolley cars derail and get buried under the brown tide. This isn't water we're talking about. Molasses is 40% denser than water, which means it hits with the force of liquid concrete. People describe being picked up and hurled through the air, not by the molasses itself, but by the rush of displaced air pushed ahead of the wave. It's like being caught in the blast of a hurricane made of syrup. Anthony DiStasio, a young boy walking home from school with his sisters, gets caught in the wave and describes it like surfing, except he's surfing on a tide of death. The molasses picks him up, carries him along its crest, then rolls him like a pebble as the wave crashes. He can't breathe, can't scream, can't even see through the brown goo clogging his eyes and nose. When he finally stops moving, he's so coated in molasses that his own mother doesn't recognize him. The physics of what happens next makes the disaster even worse. As soon as the molasses stops moving at high speed, it begins to thicken dramatically. The cold January air turns the syrup into something like thick jelly. What started as a fast-moving flood becomes a sticky trap that's impossible to escape. People who survive the initial wave find themselves stuck waist-deep in molasses that behaves like quicksand. The more they struggle, the deeper they sink. Some victims get completely buried and suffocate before rescuers can reach them. Others manage to keep their heads above the surface but can't move their arms to wipe the syrup from their faces. The wave reaches several city blocks before it finally loses momentum. Buildings that weren't destroyed by the initial impact are now surrounded by a knee-deep sea of brown misery. Windows are smashed, doors are ripped off, hinges, and everything, absolutely everything, is coated in a layer of sticky death. Horses pulling delivery wagons get caught in the flood and die exactly like flies on flypaper. They thrash and struggle, but each movement only makes them sink deeper into the molasses. Their panicked whinnying echoes through the streets until they finally disappear beneath the surface. The Boston Elevated Railway's Atlantic Avenue structure takes a direct hit from flying debris. Steel panels from the exploded tank slam into the girders with enough force to tip a streetcar off the tracks. For a moment, it looks like the entire elevated line might collapse, which would have made the disaster even worse. Within minutes, the north end looks like the aftermath of a bombing. But instead of rubble and dust, everything is covered in a thick layer of molasses that's already starting to harden in the cold air. The sweet smell that normally makes people think of cookies and candy now carries the stench of death and destruction. The strangest part? The molasses is still warm from the fermentation process, so steam rises from the brown lake covering the streets. It looks like hell, smells like a bakery, and kills like a war zone. The cold January air becomes the molasses flood's final weapon. Within minutes of the disaster, Boston's winter temperatures turn the syrup into a gelatinous nightmare that traps everything it touches. What started as a fast-moving wave now becomes a sticky prison that's nearly impossible to escape. First responders arrive to find a scene that defies comprehension. The streets are covered in waist-deep molasses that behaves like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper you sink. Rescue workers trying to reach victims find themselves getting stuck, turning potential rescuers into additional people who need saving. The USS Nantucket, a training ship docked nearby, sends 116 naval cadets under Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland to help with rescue efforts. These young men run several blocks toward the disaster, then wade into knee-deep molasses to pull out survivors. But every step forward is a battle against syrup that grabs at their boots and legs like living concrete. The victims they find are barely recognizable as human beings. People are so completely coated in molasses that rescuers can't tell who they are, how old they are, or even if they're still alive. Some victims are buried so deep that only their hands or the tops of their heads are visible above the brown surface. Others manage to keep their faces clear but can't move their arms to wipe the syrup from their eyes and mouths. The suffocation happens slowly and horribly. Molasses clogs nostrils and airways, making it impossible to breathe. Victims who try to call for help only get more syrup in their mouths. Those who attempt to wipe their faces with their hands just spread the molasses around, making the problem worse. It's like drowning in slow motion. Horses caught in the flood die exactly like flies on flypaper. The more they thrash and struggle, the deeper they sink into the sticky trap. Their panicked movements only exhaust them faster, and one by one they disappear beneath the surface. The Boston Post reports that they died like so many flies on sticky flypaper, and witnesses say the comparison is disturbingly accurate. The search for bodies continues for 4 agonizing days. Some victims are so thoroughly coated in hardened molasses that they look like brown statues rather than people. Others are found days later in Boston Harbor, where the tide carried them after the initial wave. The final body count reaches 21 dead, with about half of them literally drowning in syrup. Among the victims are 2 10-year-old children, Pasquale Antosca and Maria Di Stasio, who were walking home from school for lunch. Pasquale's father watches helplessly from their apartment window as his son disappears into the brown tide. Maria's brother Antonio survives, but he's so traumatized and covered in molasses that he can barely speak when rescuers find him. The cleanup becomes a city-wide nightmare that lasts for weeks. Fireboats pump salt water from the harbor to wash away the molasses, while crews spread tons of sand to absorb what they can't rinse away. But the sticky syrup has gotten into everything: sewers, basements, cracks in sidewalks, and the foundations of buildings. Boston Harbor turns brown and stays that way until summer. the molasses doesn't just dissolve. It creates a layer of sweetness that attracts every fly, bee, and ant in the city. The harbor smells like a candy factory mixed with rotting seaweed, and the stench carries for miles on the wind. The worst part is how the molasses spreads throughout the city like a slow-moving infection. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and curious onlookers track it on their boots and clothes. Soon, molasses appears on subway platforms, train seats, telephone handsets, and inside homes across Boston. Everything a Bostonian touches becomes sticky. Door handles, streetcar poles, shop counters. The entire city develops a thin coating of syrup that seems impossible to completely remove. The smell lingers for decades. North End residents report catching whiffs of molasses on hot summer days well into the 1950s. The sweet scent, which should remind people of cookies and candy, instead brings back memories of death and disaster. Children who grow up in the neighborhood learn to associate the smell of molasses with tragedy. The psychological impact on survivors is severe. People who lived through the flood develop a permanent fear of anything sticky or sweet. Some can't eat molasses, cookies, or pancakes with syrup without feeling nauseous. Others have nightmares about being trapped in brown quicksand, unable to breathe or move. The North End itself bears physical scars for years. Buildings that survive the initial wave are permanently stained brown up to their second-story windows. The molasses seeps into brick and mortar, creating dark watermarks that serve as a constant reminder of the disaster. Some structures have to be torn down because the syrup has weakened their foundations beyond repair. The final toll from America's strangest industrial accident is devastating. His people dead, 150 injured, and an entire neighborhood that smells like pancakes for the next 30 years. But the real legacy of the Great Molasses Flood goes far beyond the immediate casualties. The disaster sparks the first major class action lawsuit in Massachusetts history. 119 residents band together to sue the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had purchased Purity Distilling in 1917. It's a David and Goliath legal battle that drags on for 3 years and sets important precedents for corporate accountability. USIA's defense strategy is both predictable and shameless. They claim the tank was sabotaged by anarchists. According to the company, some mysterious, evilly disposed persons planted a bomb to destroy their facility because the alcohol was being used to make munitions. It's a convenient story that shifts blame away from corporate negligence and onto shadowy terrorists. But the evidence against USIA is overwhelming. The court-appointed auditor discovers that the tank was fundamentally unsound from the day it was built. The steel was too thin, the rivets were flawed, and the entire structure was a disaster waiting to happen. After 3 years of hearings, the court finds the company liable for gross negligence. The financial penalty is substantial for $1925. USIA pays $628,000 in damages, equivalent to roughly $11.4 million in today's money. Families of the victims receive about $7,000 each, a significant sum for working-class Italian immigrants, though no amount of money can truly compensate for their losses. More importantly, the disaster leads to sweeping changes in construction regulations across the United States. States begin requiring that large industrial structures be designed by licensed engineers and architects. The days of letting company treasurers with no technical experience oversee major construction projects are finally over. The Molasses Flood becomes a case study in corporate responsibility and the importance of proper oversight. It demonstrates how cutting corners and ignoring safety warnings can turn even the most innocent substances into weapons of mass destruction. The disaster proves that in the hands of careless, greedy people, even breakfast syrup can kill. Today, the site of the tank is a recreational park with baseball fields and playgrounds. A small plaque commemorates the disaster, but most visitors have no idea they're standing where 21 people died in a wave of molasses. The strangest industrial accident in American history has faded from public memory, remembered mainly by historians and the occasional curious tourist who stumbles across the story. But the lessons remain relevant. Every time a company tries to rush construction, skip safety tests, or ignore warning signs, the ghost of that molasses tank serves as a reminder of what can happen when profit matters more than people's lives. You know the story. Ancient Egypt, pyramids reaching toward the sky, golden pharaohs ruling from their thrones along the Nile. It's the civilization that built the Sphinx, created hieroglyphs, and gave us mummies wrapped in linen. Every history book starts there when talking about African greatness. But what if I told you the real pharaohs weren't Egyptian at all? What if the most powerful, wealthiest, and arguably most sophisticated kingdom in ancient Africa existed hundreds of miles south of Cairo, in what's now Sudan? What if this civilization was so threatening to Egypt that the Egyptians spent centuries trying to destroy it, then erased it from history so completely that most people today have never even heard its name? Meet the kingdom of Kerma. For over 1,000 years, from around 2500 to 1500 BC, Kerma controlled more gold than Egypt ever dreamed of. Their armies were so feared that Egypt hired Kerma warriors as mercenaries. Their trade network stretched across continents. Their architecture was revolutionary. And when their kings died, they didn't just get buried with gold and furniture like Egyptian pharaohs. They got buried with people. Hundreds of people. Living people who were killed and arranged in perfect rows around the royal tomb, still wearing their finest jewelry, ready to serve their king in the afterlife. We're talking about burial practices that make Egyptian mummification look like a gentle send-off. The largest Kerma royal tombs contain nearly 300 human sacrifices each. So here's the question that should keep you awake at night. How does a civilization that powerful, that wealthy, that advanced simply vanish from the history books? How do you raise an entire kingdom that lasted longer than most empires and controlled resources that made Egypt jealous? The answer involves one of history's most successful cover-ups, a systematic campaign to rewrite the past, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the winners don't just write history, is it entirely. This is Kerma, where being buried alive was considered an honor. Picture the perfect location for getting ridiculously wealthy in the ancient world. You'd want to control trade routes between multiple continents. You'd want access to gold mines that seem to produce endless wealth. You'd want to sit right on the Nile River, the ancient world's superhighway. And you'd want to be far enough from major powers to build your own empire without constant interference. That's exactly what Kerma had. Located in what's now northern Sudan, right at the third cataract of the Nile, Kerma controlled the ultimate trade crossroads. Goods flowing north from Central Africa had to pass through their territory. Egyptian expeditions heading south for gold, ivory, and exotic animals had to deal with Kerma. They weren't just participating in ancient trade networks, they were running them. And the gold. The Nubian gold mines that Kerma controlled made them stupidly wealthy by ancient standards. While Egypt was struggling with political chaos and foreign invasions, Kerma was literally sitting on mountains of gold. Egyptian texts from this period read like the complaints of a broke neighbor watching someone else win the lottery every week. At the heart of their capital city stood the Defufa, a massive mud brick temple that dominated the landscape. This thing was huge, nearly 60 feet tall and built like a fortress. When Egyptian architects were still figuring out basic pyramid construction, Kerma was building structures that dwarfed anything Egypt had managed. The Defufa wasn't just big, it was revolutionary in its design and engineering. Here's where it gets interesting. While Egypt was obsessed with rectangular architecture, that Egypt, everything had to be square, orderly, rigid. Kerma built in circles. Their houses were round, their ceremonial spaces were circular, even their city planning followed curved patterns. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice. Circular architecture made perfect sense for their climate and lifestyle. Round buildings are more stable, better for ventilation, and more efficient to heat and cool. The Kerma lifestyle screamed wealth and sophistication. Archaeological excavations have uncovered elaborate headdresses that would make modern fashion designers jealous. Fine leather goods that required advanced tanning techniques. Imported ceramics from distant lands that proved their trade networks reached across continents. Their metalworking was so advanced they were producing bronze and copper tools, while other civilizations were still fumbling with basic techniques. The irony is almost painful. Egypt desperately needed Kerma's gold to fund their building projects, their armies, and their bureaucracy. Egyptian texts are full of references to expeditions south to get gold from Nubian mines. But at the same time, these same Egyptian sources consistently call the Kerma people barbarians, uncivilized, backwards. This is like calling your bank manager a primitive savage while begging them for another loan. Archaeological evidence shows Kerma had everything that supposedly made Egypt great, but earlier and often better. They had complex government systems with the regional administrators. They had writing systems for record keeping. Their metallurgy was more advanced than contemporary Egyptian techniques. Their architecture showed engineering knowledge that wouldn't appear in Egypt for centuries. But here's what really made Egypt nervous. Kerma wasn't content to just be wealthy. They were building an empire, and that empire was expanding northward, right into Egypt's backyard. During Egypt's second intermediate period, when the country was weak and divided, Kerma seized the opportunity. They conquered Egyptian forts, controlled Egyptian territory, and basically treated Egypt like a client state. The balance of power in ancient Africa wasn't what your history textbook told you. For centuries, the real power was in Kerma, and Egypt knew it. But all this wealth came with a price, and that price was usually paid in blood. Congratulations, you've just been selected for royal service in Kerma. The good news is you're now part of the most elite household in Africa, with access to the finest food, clothing, and living conditions your civilization can offer. The bad news is your retirement plan involves being buried alive. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Your daily life as a Kerma royal servant was actually pretty good by ancient standards. While Egyptian peasants were eating bread made from grain mixed with sand and grit, you're dining on meat, fresh vegetables, and beer that doesn't taste like liquid disappointment. Your circular house makes sense for the climate. The curved walls create better airflow, the design is earthquake resistant, and the whole structure stays cooler during the scorching Nubian summers. You're also living in a military powerhouse. Kerma's army was built around their legendary archers, known to the Egyptians as the Magi. These weren't just good soldiers. They were so good that Egypt regularly hired them as mercenaries to fight other Egyptians. Think about that for a second. Egypt's solution to military problems was to pay Kerma warriors to handle their dirty work. The Magi were famous throughout the ancient world. Egyptian texts describe them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They could put arrows through targets at distances that made Egyptian archers look like children playing with toy bows. Their composite bows were technological marvels, and their accuracy in battle was legendary. When you see a Magi archer draw his bow, you know someone's about to have a very bad day. During Egypt's second intermediate period, around 1650 BC, Kerma didn't just defend their territory, they went on the offensive. Kerma armies marched north and conquered Egyptian forts, occupied Egyptian territory, and basically treated Egypt like a weak neighbor who couldn't pay their debts. Archaeological evidence from sites like El Kab shows that Kerma forces invaded deep into Egypt, possibly reaching as far north as Thebes. This wasn't a raid or a quick military adventure. Kerma controlled parts of Egypt for decades, administering Egyptian territories and extracting tribute from Egyptian cities. The tables had completely turned Egypt, the supposed superpower, was paying tribute to Kerma. But here's where your job as a royal servant gets complicated. Kerma's approach to royal funerals made Egyptian mummification look like a gentle spa treatment. When your king died, you didn't get a pension and a nice retirement cottage. You got selected for the ultimate honor, eternal service in the afterlife. The royal burial grounds at Kerma are an archaeological horror show. The largest tumuli, nearly 300 feet in diameter, contained the remains of hundreds of people who were killed and buried with their king. These weren't random victims. They were carefully selected servants, craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators. Each person was arranged in precise positions around the royal burial chamber, still wearing their finest jewelry and clothing. The contrast with Egyptian burial practices is striking. Egyptians preserved bodies through mummification because they believed the physical body was necessary for the afterlife. Kerma took a more direct approach. They just sent you there immediately, no preservation required. Both cultures were obsessed with death and the afterlife, but they had completely different philosophies about how to get there. Recent excavations have revealed the systematic nature of these sacrifices. Servants were arranged in neat rows, grouped by their roles and status. Guards were positioned as if still protecting the king. Craftsmen were buried with their tools. Women were arranged with their children. Everyone maintained their social positions, even in death. Here's the disturbing part. Many of these people probably volunteered. Kerma religious beliefs emphasized eternal service and afterlife rewards. Being selected for royal burial wasn't seen as a death sentence, but as the ultimate promotion. You'd spend eternity in the royal household, with guaranteed status and comfort in the next world. The archaeological evidence suggests these weren't panicked executions, but organized ceremonies. People were dressed in their finest clothes, arranged carefully, and buried with personal possessions. Some tombs show evidence of ritual feasting before the burials, suggesting these were religious ceremonies rather than mass murders. Still, imagine being a royal servant knowing that your job security literally depended on your boss staying alive. Every royal cold or minor injury must have caused serious anxiety among the household staff. Of course, having better warriors and more gold tends to make your neighbors nervous. Egypt had a problem. For centuries, they'd been the underdogs in their relationship with Kerma, desperately needing Nubian gold while watching their southern neighbors build a more successful civilization. Egyptian pride couldn't handle the reality that these so-called barbarians were outperforming them in almost every metric that mattered. So Egypt did what insecure powers have always done. They launched a propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors jealous. The systematic rewriting of Kerma out of history began with Egypt's military conquest under Thutmose, the first around 1500 BC. This wasn't just a war. It was Egypt's final solution to the Kerma problem. Egyptian armies didn't just defeat Kerma's forces, they destroyed the city, scattered the population, and began the process of cultural erasure that would last for millennia. But here's where Egyptian hypocrisy reaches almost comical levels. Even as they were calling Kerma people primitive and uncivilized, Egyptian architects were busy copying Kerma building techniques. Egyptian priests were adopting Kerma gods and incorporating them into their pantheon. Egyptian burial practices suddenly started including elements that looked suspiciously similar to Kerma traditions. The Egyptians didn't just conquer Kerma, they stole their innovations, rebranded them as Egyptian inventions, and then claimed the original creators were backward savages who contributed nothing to civilization. The renaming campaign was particularly effective. Kerma disappeared from official records. The region became Kush, and later Egyptian sources consistently used this new name when referring to the area. It's like conquering France and then insisting it had always been called East Germany, until everyone forgets the original name ever existed. Egyptian texts from this period are masterpieces of historical revisionism. They describe the conquest of Kerma as bringing civilization to barbarians, introducing writing to people who couldn't read, and teaching architecture to people who lived in mud huts. The fact that Kerma had been more advanced than Egypt for centuries simply vanished from the official narrative. The ultimate irony came centuries later during Egypt's 25th dynasty, when Nubian rulers conquered Egypt and became pharaohs themselves. These black pharaohs ruled Egypt for nearly a century, from around 747 to 656 BC, and were among the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. They restored Egyptian temples, revived Egyptian art and culture, and even conquered territories that previous Egyptian dynasties had lost. But modern Egypt tries to downplay this period. Museums display artifacts from Nubian pharaohs without emphasizing their African origins. History textbooks gloss over the fact that some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs weren't ethnically Egyptian at all. The narrative of Egyptian superiority requires minimizing any evidence that contradicts it. Contemporary Egyptian sources actually provide evidence of their fear and respect for Kerma military power. One text describes Kerma warriors as strong of arm, without equal, who shoot arrows like rain. Another warns of their swift chariots and countless archers. These aren't descriptions of primitive barbarians. They're acknowledgments of superior military technology and tactics. Modern archaeology has been systematically proving Kerma's sophistication, but it took decades to overcome the Egyptian narrative. Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet spent 20 years challenging the academic consensus that Kerma was just an Egyptian outpost. When he first argued that Kerma was an independent African civilization, Egyptologists dismissed his evidence and insisted the Egyptian sources were more reliable. Bonnet's excavations revealed royal statues, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated urban planning, and evidence of complex government systems. The famous cache of 25th dynasty pharaoh statues, discovered in 2003, included masterpieces that rank among the greatest achievements in art history. These weren't crude tribal artifacts. They were works of genius that rival anything produced in Egypt itself. But academic momentum is powerful. Generations of scholars had built careers on the assumption that civilization in Africa flowed from north to south, with Egypt as the source and everything else as primitive imitation. Admitting that Kerma was more advanced than contemporary Egypt meant acknowledging that this fundamental assumption was wrong. There's also the uncomfortable reality of racism in early archaeology. Colonial-era archaeologists approached African sites with the assumption that anything impressive must have been built by outsiders. When they found sophisticated architecture in Kerma, their first instinct was to credit Egyptian influence rather than acknowledge indigenous African achievement. This bias persisted well into the 20th century. Even when evidence clearly showed Kerma's independence and sophistication, many scholars prefer to minimize its significance rather than challenge established narratives about African civilization. The result is that most people today have never heard of Kerma, despite its 1,000-year dominance of the upper Nile Valley. Egypt successfully erased its greatest rival from popular consciousness, creating a version of African history that centers Egyptian achievement while ignoring their neighboring civilizations that were often more impressive. So how do you completely erase a civilization that lasted longer than most empires? You start with military conquest, continue with cultural appropriation, and finish with academic neglect. The systematic erasure of Kerma represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Consider the timeline. Kerma flourished for over 1,000 years, from around 2500 to 1500 BC. During this period, Egypt experienced multiple collapses, foreign conquests, and periods of political chaos. The Middle Kingdom fell apart. The Second Intermediate Period saw Egypt divided and weak. Even during Egypt's stronger periods, they were constantly worried about Kerma's growing power. Meanwhile, Kerma maintained political stability, economic prosperity, and territorial control for centuries. By any reasonable measure, Kerma was the more successful civilization. Yet Egypt gets remembered as the eternal powerhouse, while Kerma gets forgotten entirely. The bitter irony is that Egypt's golden age was literally built on Kerma's actual gold. Egyptian temples, pyramids, and royal treasures were funded by wealth extracted from Nubian mines that Kerma had controlled for centuries. Egypt's greatest achievements were financed by their southern neighbors, but the historical narrative gives Egypt all the credit. Today, modern Sudan sits on archaeological treasures that could rewrite our understanding of African history. Sites throughout the region contain evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgy, complex trade networks, and artistic achievements that rival anything produced in the ancient world. But funding for Sudanese archaeology remains limited, and many sites remain unexplored. This matters because it challenges the fundamental narrative that civilization flowed from north to south in Africa. The Kerma evidence suggests that innovation and sophistication developed independently throughout the continent, with southern regions often leading rather than following northern developments. The story of Kerma's erasure reminds us that historical winners don't just write the history books. Sometimes they delete entire civilizations from memory. The most successful propaganda isn't obvious lies. It's simply making certain truths disappear entirely.